Today, we're talking about how you can hook your reader. I know this is a fish, but fish, hooks. It's also something the cat plays with, so it's disgusting. We're not actually talking about hooks. I only did that to do the fish thing. What we're actually talking about is openings. The first scene, first part of a scene, really the first idea that you're presenting to the reader. The opening is important, and with the continuing decline of the average person's attention span, it's more important than ever. A bad opening won't give the reader reasons to stick around, no matter how good the rest of the book is. If you haven't got them on the line with your first few paragraphs, then you're likely sunk, to continue with the fish metaphor. So to help you avoid this, here are 3 tips on how to write your opening. Tip number 1. Get to the character and what they want quickly. A wise man once said novels are about people doing stuff, or robots or elves or something else doing stuff. Characters and what they set out to achieve are a major reason any reader reads any book. One might say it's the only reason. If your opening paragraphs are laden with exposition or descriptions of the weather or descriptions of the setting, then you're delaying the introduction of your characters and what they want. Now, the first character the reader sees doesn't need to be the protagonist or even a member of the main cast. This is especially true if you're writing a prologue, although be warned that readers will get attached to the first character they are introduced to, so be careful if this character is not your protagonist. Now, when I say start with character, I don't mean start with a character description. Several long, flowing paragraphs describing every detail and feature of a character that we've yet to actually be introduced to is as bad, or if not worse, than not introducing that character at all. In most cases, it's better to save the character description until later on, or introduce different pieces of the description as they become relevant in the opening scene. You want to be focused on what the character is doing and what they want, not what they look like. You can also go overboard with this by introducing too many characters too quickly. This is a really good way to confuse the reader and bog down your opening. Usually you want to stick to, I would say, no more than 2 or 3 named characters in your opening scene, which is why the cat has left, because I worried there was too many characters. I'll get rid of the fish too. Because after all, if you spend all your time introducing characters, you won't have time to... Tip number 2, remember to establish tone. Or remember that you are establishing tone. I talked about tone in an earlier video that I won't remember to link to, but as a quick refresher, tone is the attitude in which a piece is written. It's how the author is approaching the subject matter of the story. Tone arises out of what is emphasized, how things are paced, how settings are described. All of these things work together to convey tone. The tone can be humorous or serious, optimistic or pessimistic, nostalgic or subversive. There's all kinds of different tones out there. And what tone you set in your first scene is going to be largely the tone the reader will expect through the rest of the book. If your first scene is a real tearjerker, but then the next scene is the start of a wacky adventure, then that could be a problem. Your first scene has established the tone as one thing, and the rest of the book turns out to be something else. You're making a very early promise with your opening scene, and you want to make sure that you're making the right promise. If you make the wrong promise with tone, you're not only dissuading readers who liked your opening but then didn't like the subsequent parts of the book, you're also losing the readers who would have liked the rest of the book because the opening wasn't what they were expecting or wasn't what they prefer. This doesn't mean that you can't have lighter moments later on in the story if you begin with a completely serious opening tone. But what you want to avoid is a major shift in tone. So what if you have a bad thing that's going to happen later on in your story? Something that disrupts an idyllic or perfect status quo. How do you start an opening that sets the right tone in that situation? Well, I'm glad I asked myself that question because tip number 3, your opening should give a sense of what's coming later. Your opening scene doesn't necessarily have to start with the emotional intensity that the rest of the story has. but it should drop a few big hints. You want to clue the reader into not just the tone of the story, but also what the main conflict is going to look like. If the main conflict isn't present in the first part of the story, or it doesn't make sense to include it in the first scene, then you should likely try your best to allude to it in some way. If you can't really find a good way to allude to it, you can also introduce a different conflict that gets settled in the first part of the story that is potentially related to the main conflict of the story. This gets into foreshadowing and promises, which I've talked about in various videos in the past, and it's one of the most important things your opening needs to accomplish. After all, the reader is reading the opening to see if it's a story they want to stick around with, and in order to make that decision, they need to know what it is they're sticking around for. You don't need to lay out exactly what's going to happen, but the reader should have an inkling or a suggestion of what direction the story is going. The most common way to do this is to create an intriguing question in your opening that the reader desperately wants answered. This question doesn't have to be the main question that will solve everything in the plot, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a question that the protagonist or the main cast wants answers. It could just be something the reader hasn't had an answer to yet. The answer to this question, or finding the answer to this question, can lead to other questions that will play out later in the story. Your opening doesn't have to begin with everything that's going to happen laid out before the reader. In fact, it probably shouldn't. But they need to leave the opening with at least one intriguing question that they desperately want an answer to. Like you're wondering how I'm going to conclude this video. Poorly, as usual, is how. So there you have it. There's all kinds of stuff I didn't cover because I didn't want this video to run super long. Obviously, don't start with an info dump. Don't start with a dream sequence. Don't start with a character getting out of bed unless the reason that they're getting out of bed is because they're being shot at or there's aliens or something dramatic like that. Also, try to begin the story at the right point. You don't want to start too early or too late after the first events of the story. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and found the advice in it useful. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other writing advice related videos and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos every Wednesday. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. I'll try to keep the cat there for longer next time, anyway.